Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have on the show again Trita Parsi, a distinguished scholar in Iran, the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a war-winning author, and co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Trita, nice to see you. Last time you were on was when Trump and Netanyahu were bombing Iran. At the time, it was really us bombing it. And now we have all these protests in the news. So I'm so glad you have a little time. I know you're in big demand, so thanks for
My pleasure. Always happy to be with you.
So these protests, all of a sudden they caught up on us. I think it began at the end of December, and now it is much bigger. Can you tell people a little one-on-one on these protests? What sparked this? What's going on?
So what sparked it, the immediate spark was a collapse of the currency, which immediately impacted traders, shopkeepers, and they were the ones who first started to go out and protest in the middle of the day. Very quickly, however, it morphed into a different kind of a protest in which the demands were no longer, anger at the regime for its economic failures, but rather at the regime as a whole, calling for the overthrow of the government, which is not in and of itself surprising. We have seen that happen several times in the past. It's a reflection of the fact that society is by and large extremely unhappy. It's a very unpopular regime. So even if something starts off as economic, it quickly morphs into something else. But it was actually not at a very high level or in terms of numbers for the first couple of days. But then last Thursday, they kind of exploded and you had huge amounts of people going out. That's the time when the government then closes down the internet entirely, including jamming Starlink. There had been efforts to put in Starlink into Iran for a situation like this, but the government turned out to be very effective in jamming it. Not 100%, but way more than I think a lot of people expected, which is part of the reason
Right.
why for some time we couldn't get a hold of anyone in Iran. Very few videos came out. Some of the videos that have been circulating are actually spread by the Iranian state TV itself and people who are working with them and do have ways of sidelining the jamming of Starlink and other ways of getting in contact with the world. In the last couple of days, however, the number of protesters have actually dwindled, particularly in Tehran. The reason for that is primarily because of an extremely brutal clampdown by the authorities, probably killing more than 1,000 people, perhaps more. But I think also there's another factor here that perhaps people don't like to talk about, but it's just undeniable given the images that are coming out. These protests also have a component of them, not all in any way, shape, or form, but you have a component of them that are also far more violent than we have seen in previous protests. I mean, there's videos of how they put police officers on fire, in addition to buildings and things of that nature. And what that tends to do, at least in the past, when things get violent from the protester side, it actually has a repellent effect on a lot of other protesters who don't want to be part of that. I don't
Right.
think that is the main reason. I think the main reason is actually the brutality of the government itself. And then, of course, we should keep in mind that protests tend to have a rhythm of their own. They don't necessarily just increase day by day. They go down sometimes, they go up. So just because the fact that it's been down for 3 days does not necessarily mean that it's over. And it certainly doesn't mean that the government in any way, shape, or form have addressed the core concerns that exist, very legitimate concerns that exist in society that actually could bring about a more stable situation.
So in 2022, we saw protests after the killing of Masa Amini. And I actually think I had Maz Jobrani, a mutual friend, on, or even you could have been on as well, but I think I had Maz on as well to talk about that. And how do you compare these protests to those? Is it different in terms of the amount of people? You already mentioned the violence, so I don't remember that in the 22 protest. And is this, because I've seen some experts say that the country's regime is the weakest it's been since 1979, and I don't know what's accurate or what's not, so I look to you.
Well, the growth of the Massa protests were at a different speed. They ended up becoming very large, not at all as large as they were in 2009, but still the largest since 2009. And they gradually grew. Whereas here we have something that was relatively low, although it got a lot of attention in media and on social media, and then just kind of exploded and now is dying down again. So there's a difference there. There's also a difference if you remember the images that came out of Massa, those were mostly protests during the daytime.
Right.
Most of the images you see now, these protests are taking place at night. It's much more difficult to discern exactly what is happening. It's much more difficult to be able to assess the size of the crowds. It's much more difficult to be able to see who is actually responsible for the violence. It's easier for elements who want to pursue violence to be able to do so under the guise of all of the other peaceful protesters. And again, choosing of the evening was something that the protesters themselves did, and that's actually very different from what we've seen before. I'm sure you remember the images of roughly 2 million people out on the streets in the middle of the day in 2009 protesting
Wow.
the election
Right.
stealing, whereas that's not what we're seeing now. We also have a gradually radicalized population because they're sick and tired of living under this regime. They're sick and tired of seeing that all kinds of efforts for change have failed. In 2009, it was about reforming of the system. In 2022, it was about the overthrow of the system, but still, the slogans were nowhere near as radical as we're hearing now, things being. And I think, again, to some extent, that may have been because of influence from external actors, but to a very large extent, it's just because people are getting more and more desperate. In my view, part of the reason why I have opposed policies of sanctions and confrontation is precisely because of the fact that it was so clear that if you destroy the economy, if you destroy the middle class, people will become desperate. And in desperation, it may increase the likelihood of protest and certainly increase the likelihood of violent protest. I don't see it increasing the likelihood of protests leading to a democratic transition. And that is also because that is the experience that we've seen in many other countries. So just having this type of a desperation, yes, it may explode into protest, but we may also have seen several thousand people killed right now without it actually leading to a different situation.
When you say these protests are more radicalized, I was reading that there was chants, death to Khomeini. Is it Khomeini? Is that how you pronounce it? Or
I think those are Khamenei, the
Khamenei?
current supreme leader. Yeah.
Right, to the supreme leader. Is that unusual? Because in the reporting, it seemed interesting
No,
that they made a point about that.
yeah, well, I mean, it certainly is not unimportant, but not new. You had that even towards the end of the 2009 protests, in which, again, you saw it slowly radicalizing and going much, much harsher and even targeting him, death to the dictator. In 2022, those slogans were heard very early on.
Okay.
You also had slogans saying "Long live the Shah," but it was mostly a respect for the previous Shah and to his father. Now you have slogans of calling for the return of the son of the Shah.
Yeah.
Whether that is necessarily an actual support for him, or whether it is, a further step in the radicalization, how can you be as insulting as possible to the regime?
Wow.
Or whether it is to use him as an instrument because he has kind of emerged as one of the individuals that may be symbolizing these protests in the outside, it's not entirely clear. I think one thing that is clear is that there are elements who have reached a conclusion. Reform has not worked. Masa Amini type of protests have not worked. And doesn't matter if protest at this point even leads to a potential Syria situation. There's a huge risk, but there's also a potential reward, they believe, that things could get better. Whereas with the status quo, they only see risk. I don't think that is the majority of the population, but it is a growing number of the population. And again, in my view, it is because people have just grown desperate.
Mhm.
The majority of that desperation is because of the policies of the government, the repression. But a lot of it is also because of the fact that the economy is completely destroyed by these sanctions, particularly the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed after they walked out of the JCPOA. And out of that desperation, you will
Mhm.
see violence, you will see protests. The likelihood of transition to democracy, I think, however, is going down.
The I know there's no polling. I guess there's no legitimate polling. Can you give a sense, because we don't know watching it, what percentage of Iranians support the regime and what want change? And I guess the ones who oppose it, there might be different fragments to it about some might want the son of the Shah, some want true democracy, a democratic republic, whatever. But what can you share with us about the people of Iran?
So in the past, it was assessed that about 25 to 30% of the population were actually core supporters
Mm-hmm.
of the regime. I think it is widely accepted that those numbers have gone down after every protest wave, after every use of violence, in the sense that it is repelling many of the regime supporters. Well, you actually have a lot of dissent within the regime itself. But the biggest portion have actually been the ones who want to get rid of the regime, but not at the expense of major instability, potential violence, and civil war. What seems to have happened in the last couple of years is that that element has also shrunk, and more, particularly amongst the young generation, um, who have their entire life ahead of them. If you're sitting in their shoes and you're 20 years old and you see that for the last 25 years, there's been talk about reform, etc., and it's not led to anything, but it's
Right.
actually led to a worse situation, and you have 60 years ahead of you, yes, it's not unreasonable that someone like that with those type of prospects will have a very different calculation than someone who's 40 or someone who's 60. But it's also important to understand that Iran is no longer that young country. 30 years ago, there was so much talk about, oh, this is such a young country. The average age is 25 or something like that. Well, those people are now 45. And the younger elements of the society is actually smaller, much smaller than it was 25 years ago.
Interesting. So, and another thing, a lot of people will ask, like, they'll watch what's going on. We've watched these protests over the years. We've seen news stories. We've seen, even in movies, they've talked about, will the Iranian people really rise up? And is it a pipe dream? Uh, why haven't, if the core support's only 20, 25%, why hasn't this regime fallen by its own weight and by its own failures?
So that's a great question. And in many ways, it's part of the mystery because it is an unpopular regime. In many ways, it's been quite incompetent, corruption, all of these different things. And there's many different factors that come into answering that question. One is this is not the same as the regimes of Iraq under Saddam, Libya under Gaddafi, or even Assad in Syria, in which if you actually take out the top person, Gaddafi, Saddam, or Assad, the rest of it falls apart.
Mhm.
This system is itself a revolutionary system, and it was designed to be able to withstand the counter-revolution. Power is dispersed throughout the system. I'm not saying that, if there was an assassination of the supreme leader, that it wouldn't lead to a major crisis, but it is not so that you can essentially, for instance, negotiate that he gives up, and as a result, the whole system collapses as a whole, or if he were to flee. It's not like that. The Shah's government was certainly like that. I remember when during the time of the Shah, three Iranian generals could not even call for a meeting just to talk about, what they should have for lunch the next week, because the Secret Service would immediately believe that they were plotting to do a coup against the Shah. And at the same time, they didn't dare to give Shah bad news because all the decision making, not just all the power, all of the decision making was centered in the hands of the Shah. So many of the Iranian generals at the time were actually going to the Israelis because of the close relationship that Iran and Israel had at the time. They were asking Moshe Dayan, can you go and give this briefing to the Shah and tell them what actually is happening in the country? The current system, with all of its gazillion flaws, is not structured in that way. That's not to say that Khamenei may not be very isolated and the distance between him and the people has grown significantly. I mean, he's been in charge for more than 30 years. It
Right.
would be shocking if he actually was in touch with the sentiments of the younger generation, for instance. But that, I think, is a very critical factor. It makes it much more difficult. With that, you do have also the experience of the revolution in which everyone wanted to get rid of the Shah, and they ended up with, in my view, a much worse system, a much more repressive system, and then terrible consequences, the war and everything else that has happened. So that element who still wants to get rid of the regime, but not at the expense of instability, they're still very, very important, even though they may be smaller now than they were 10 years ago because of this radicalization. And the last factor, and this is by no means an exhaustive answer, I'm sure there's 10, 15 other factors and variables that should be mentioned. But the other one that I think is relevant to mention now, because we have talked about some opposition figures, is that this regime has been blessed by an astoundingly incompetent opposition.
Oh,
And you're in LA, I believe. Dean, are you in LA?
no, no, I'm in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Okay, for some
Oh,
reason I
yeah.
thought we were in LA.
Oh, no.
I don't know if you saw the images of what happened yesterday at one of the
Yeah.
protests by
With the U-Haul truck.
pro-monarchists, and then this truck came in, and the original images that came out made it look as if he deliberately drove into the crowd, Images that have now come out have shown that he actually wasn't, but they were trying to lynch him. They broke the windows of his truck. And then once the lynching essentially was about to happen, he kind of panicked and it looks as if he's trying to escape. And then later on, he got lynched anyways while the police was arresting him. Look, you look at that guy appears to be from the Mujahideen Khalq organization, which was an organization that was on the terrorist list. And the crowd are clearly monarchists with signs of the son of the Shah, Israeli flags, etc. Look, if you're sitting in Iran, not if you're in the younger generation that is just sick and tired, but if you're sitting in Iran, you still feel like you have something to lose. You look at these alternatives, you're not inspired. You're not thinking, okay, this is going to actually bring about a better situation. You may absolutely loathe the regime, but you still want to make sure that you have some sort of idea what comes next. Again, I want to emphasize my impression is that the people who reason that way are smaller today than 10 years ago because the desperation has grown. And that there's more people who think, you know what, I don't care. Let's just get rid of this regime. Doesn't matter what the opposition looks like. Anyone who can just get rid of the regime and we'll deal with the consequences afterwards.
We had Trump talk about threaten the Iranian leadership. If you kill anyone, we're going to come in and do something. You're saying, I saw different reports. Some say 500 were killed. You're saying 1,000 are killed. What do you think the point of Trump in saying, I don't mean getting into his mind, was it strategic? Is there something else going on that we don't know about? Or could it actually have been a sincere gesture by him?
Well, sincere gesture in the sense that he really cares about the well-being of Iranian protesters?
Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah.
Right.
Was it sincere in the sense that he wanted to have a pretext to attack? Could be that he wanted to add another reason. So it's, because he himself said that the nuclear program has been eliminated, obliterated. So if he wants to use military strikes, perhaps he needs another motivation.
Right.
Could be. I think also what frankly was happening was that there were elements who were trying to get him. I mean, Netanyahu visited with him from December 29th to January 1st, I believe. And the
Right.
top agenda item was to convince him to go and bomb Iran. And they were showing images of protests, and I think there was an effort to give Trump the impression they're really weak, they're about to fall. All you need to do is push a little bit, and you can get the credit. You can be the one who, without much of a cost or a risk, can be the president that ends this Islamic Republic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to understand that Trump doesn't necessarily have he's not against in principle taking military action or regime change. He's just against things that are messy and costly and doesn't have more or less a guaranteed a likelihood of success that he can brag about later. If you then present to him the image that, look, this regime is about to fall anyways, people are out there protesting, you can just do small military strikes, you will be the hero. This is something I think he would fall for. And it seems like that actually has been effective. And then he comes out and says this thing, makes that threat about striking if the protesters are killed. What is very clear is that the regime killed protesters in very large numbers, regardless of Trump's threat. In fact, I would go one step further. It appears that it has also been counterproductive because now you have the Iranian army also going out and saying that they see that they will act against what they call terrorist cells inside the country for the national security. The reason why this is important is because the Iranian army has sat out all of these other protests. They've been called in and they say, nope, that's not our job. Our job is to protect the country from external threats, but we're not going to be your tools to suppress protesters. So instead, they call in the Basij, they call in the IRGC. But now, for the first time, you have the army saying something like this as well. And I think it is because the perception on their side is, which is not, surprising, that their perception is that the protests are intertwined with external threats, mindful of the fact that Trump is making these threats, the Israelis making these threats. The Israelis are openly talking about how they have Mossad agents in Iran as part of the protest, whether that's true or not. Perhaps they're saying as part of the PSYOP, but they clearly are in Iran. We know that from the war in June. And then, of course, Mike Pompeo, the former CIA head, tweeting the same thing. So under those circumstances, the perception in the regime is clearly going to be that these things are intertwined. But instead of backing out, backing down, or seeing defections from the security apparatus, we actually appear to be seeing a consolidation.
And you mentioned that in the past, the army said, we're not going to do this, even though the supreme leader want them to do that. For me as an outsider, it seems odd because it seems like there would be such a tight control on the entire state apparatus from the top to the bottom. How can the military in the past been able to get away with saying, nope, we're not doing this?
Because it's a great question, because I think, again, this is one of those surprising situations in Iran. The IRGC was created by the revolutionary leadership precisely because they did not trust the Iranian army. The Iranian army had, of course, been something that the Shah and his father had built up. They tended to be quite loyal to the Shah, but of course, there were dissent there as well. But the revolutionaries never trusted them. So they created this parallel army, the Revolutionary Guards, who, by their name, are there to guard the revolution.
Right.
And those are the ones that they've used. In fact, the army has a degree of respect, and one of the institutions in Iran that actually still enjoys some support, and it's partly because they have stayed out of these different things. But this time around, they made that statement, and I know that could not possibly be something that was easy for them to do. But I think they perceive the situation, which is also very different from 2022 or from 2009, that these protests are taking place within a completely different geopolitical context, one in which the superpower of the world is making daily threats about bombing them, in which the superpower's closest friend in the region already has bombed and has promised to bomb them again. That's a very different scenario from 2022 or 2009.
Is there any evidence that you've seen that the U.S. might be involved in fueling the protests?
I've not seen any evidence that the US is clearly on the side of the Israelis. I think there are at least some circumstantial evidence, as well as, their own statements, but whether those are psyops or something else, it's not entirely clear. I think it would be very dangerous to just accept it at face value, but at the same time would be also very dangerous to completely dismiss it as just propaganda coming out of the Iranian government. I mean, for certain, they have been saying this about almost every protest that have taken place so far, that there are foreign elements involved. This is the first time in which foreign elements claim that they are involved.
Yeah, and in the Israeli press, apparently Netanyahu's saying, well, if this regime falls, it'll be like the old days where Israel and Iran were very close, and you referenced that earlier, how they were close. So there are concerns there. I saw that today Iran, the government, at least the reporting is they're willing to negotiate with the U.S. based on, quote, mutual respect and interests, according to the Iran foreign minister. What does that mean?
The Iranians have actually, there's been contacts between the government and the Trump administration throughout all of this. There have been additional efforts, whether they are substantially different or not, we don't know yet. And the Trump administration itself has also signaled that willingness. I think for Trump, coming out and saying this now is partly because it is true. There's another mediation effort in the making, but it's also very important for him to be able to say, my military threats got the Iranians to come to the table. It's not necessarily true at all, but precisely because he hasn't taken military action. In fact, at one point when he was confronted about this, and people said, you said you're going to take military action, and people have now been killed. What are you going to do? And he said, well, those people were killed in a stampede 3 times. I've not come across anyone that have any evidence of any stampede taking place, and that would be the reason why protesters got killed. So again, he has the ability of creating his own reality. He has the ability to put forward a red line and just completely walk away from it. He has the ability to say that he wants regime change in Venezuela, but then give it to the number 2 in Venezuela. So I mean, he does more or less what he wants. And in this specific case, I think it was important for him to be able to point that, his threat did deliver something, but I don't think those comments are coming, though that outreach, which is not necessarily coming from the Iranians, there's a little bit more of a complex reality there, is a result of those threats.
And last thing, Trita Parsi, I saw the regime in Iran is labeling the protesters as enemy of God and terrorists and stuff like that. And obviously they've killed so many, but do you see parallels? And I don't want to make this just about domestic politics. I happen to focus on it, where, for example, after ICE killed Renee Good, they called her a terrorist right away, within hours. There was not even no proof, and doubled down and tripled down on it and lied about what we were able to see in the video. Is that, on some level, conjure up what a regime in Iran does with their own people?
I mean, it is so sad to have that conversation, Dean, right? That, that there are these parallels. I would perhaps go take it in a different direction, which is perhaps even more cynical. I wouldn't put it beyond the government that they believed that if they actually clamped down extremely violently, quickly, and managed to get the situation under control, that actually would impress Trump, and that they would be in a better position to negotiate with Trump, because Trump seems to have respect for those type of rulers that do things like this.
Interesting. That's interesting. I didn't want to make it too simplistic and too like reductive, where I'm like, well, there's all the same. I have my own agenda on politics, as you know. It's great chatting. Thanks for making time. I know you're busy. Where can people follow your work? Is it the Quincy Institute or online? What would you like them to follow?
They should go to the Quincy Institute's website, quincyinst.org. They can go to my Twitter, which is tparsi, or to my website, tritaparsi.com.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good
Appreciate
day.
it.